The Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl in 2024, and in this upcoming season, they are the reigning and defending Super Bowl champion. But with the title in Philadelphia, all the pressure will be on them to repeat. So in today's video, I want to talk about why the Philadelphia Eagles will repeat as champions in 2025. Subscribe and like the video if you do go on to enjoy. Let's hop into it. So we are going to begin this video off by talking about everything they did in the offseason to find ways to somewhat improve the roster. I also want to talk about what they lost and the overall significance of those losses. And then later in the video, we'll go through the depth chart and do all that fun stuff. Let us begin with what they did in free agency. So admittedly speaking, especially compared to previous off seasons, this was one of the more quiet off seasons for this Philadelphia Eagles team. They did not really hand out any massive contracts, but they did give a one-year deal to Azeez Ojulari, Harrison Bryant, Joshua Uche. A little bit more down the board, they also gave A.J. Dillon a contract. They released Darius Slay and James Bradberry. They traded away quarterback Kenny Pickett, and they also traded away C.J. Gardner-Johnson. In return, they got Kenyon Green, and Kenyon Green's no longer on the roster, so that trade was kind of silly. But they also made some other nice moves by extending Saquon Barkley to a 2-year, $41 million deal. They extended Lane Johnson by an extra year as well, and they re-signed linebacker Zach Bond. Now, it's also important to mention who they lost here. Of course, when you're the reigning defending champion, you're going to lose some people in free agency because some of these contracts you simply cannot match. So some really important players like Milton Williams was gone. Josh Sweat also left. Mekhi Becton is also no longer on the team. And a handful of guys here and there. Those are probably the big name guys. And let's be honest, those are some big losses. Not necessarily because those guys were the superstars of the team, but a lot of those guys added depth or really finished off a unit. Mekhi Becton, for example, he kind of was the cherry on top to what was an awesome offensive line. Josh Sweat was a really important and arguably their best edge rusher in their entire team. Milton Williams, while not necessarily a full-time starter, was that third guy in that interior that could seriously get after the quarterback. So without those pieces, you're going to have to find ways to find guys that can fill their roles. And that's not necessarily going to be easy for most teams, except for the Philadelphia Eagles. If there is any team that I could imagine finding ways to replace those pieces, it would be Philadelphia. They have just consistently drafted and developed so nicely. So even though you lose a Josh Sweat, Nolan Smith has been waiting and developing the past 2 years, and now he's probably going to be your full-time edge rusher. You lose Milton Williams, but you have a Moro Ojomo who's been developing nicely. They also can draft guys for whatever reason between like the 3rd and 6th round in the defensive line, and they just somehow manage to pan out. Like Josh Sweat and Milton Williams were like middle of the draft picks. So a guy like a Ty Robinson, for example, I could see him having a really nice career. So the losses were big, but they have found guys that can fill in roles and play at a high enough level that they feel confident that those losses were not massive. I think the reason why they prioritized the Zach Bond was because at the time they didn't really have a guy that could fill in that role that they felt quite confident in. So they wanted to prioritize bringing him back, who had an awesome year last year, more so than a Milton Williams, because you already had a Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, and a Moro Ojomo just waiting in the wings. Same thing with the cornerbacks. Obviously, you want to open up a bit more cap space so Darius Slay and James Bradberry go out the door. But you drafted 2 cornerbacks last year that helped you win the Super Bowl in Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. So those losses really were not that big. Now, granted, I don't want to just throw them aside and say that they don't matter. Those players were huge and critical pieces to help them win that Super Bowl. But I'm also not going to sit here and say that those losses are the difference between them going from Super Bowl champions to all of a sudden not making it to the Super Bowl again. Could they end up being bigger losses than what I'm making them out to be? For sure, it's definitely possible. But this Eagles team has enough talent to overcome some obstacles of losing a little bit of depth. Now, when it comes to the pieces they did bring in, I'm not really expecting a whole bunch. The big ticket, I guess, was Azeez Ojulari, who has had success getting after the quarterback, but has never really been a full-time starter where he's been with the New York Giants. Via PFF last year, he had a 56.4 overall grade and had 7 sacks with a 54.6 pass rush grade. But in years past, like his rookie season, he did have 10 sacks on the year, and in 2022, he also had 6 sacks on the year. Now, via PFF as well, he's only ever had a pass rush grade. The highest he's ever had was a 64.0, so take that as you will. Josh Uche has been kind of just floating around the league for a couple years. He had one big year where he had like, I think 12 sacks on the season, and then since then has been consistently around the 3 to 2 sack mark. So as right now, it's quite difficult to really tell you that those guys are going to be impactful guys on this roster. But because you have had a Nolan Smith developing, and because you have been developing Jalex Hunt and a couple other guys, it's not like the biggest deal that those guys are a little bit less proven. Nolan Smith will be the go-to pass rusher this year that's going to take over that Josh Sweat role. And then you just need somebody opposite of him who can sometimes get after the quarterback, because the interior pass rush will be fine with a Jalen Carter there. Not to mention they have some linebackers that I think could definitely get after the quarterback. Keep an eye on Jahad Campbell. I think he could also potentially come off the edge occasionally to get after the quarterback. So in general, like, yes, they lost more than they really gained in free agency, but I didn't necessarily think the free agency was the difference between them winning it all and them not winning it all. So with that said, let's go ahead and hop into the 2025 NFL draft. And per usual, this is really where the Eagles make their money. This is where the Eagles somehow find talent in just odd places, and it usually pans out. So with their first overall pick number 31, they took one of my favorite prospects in the entire draft, linebacker from Alabama, Jahad Campbell. Now, he has been somebody that has been dealing with some injuries throughout this process, and I think he's starting to get fully healthy, but I'm not quite sure what his role is going to really be on this roster, because he does have some competition in front of him, like a Zach Bond who just got paid, and a Kobe Dean who's been on this roster for a few years. Not to mention, I've heard some really positive things about Jeremiah Trotter, who they took, I think, last year. So some competition here for him to kind of overcome, but I think Jahad Campbell is just such a talented player that can completely wreck games. I think you just have to find space for him on the field. I really would not be surprised that if Philadelphia decided to kick him out as an edge rusher, where he was an edge rusher coming out of high school and just had to find his way on the field in Bama, so he played linebacker. I wouldn't necessarily be too surprised if Philly just kind of tests him out as an edge rusher to see if he can give them some productivity there. But if he does stick as an off-ball linebacker, I think he has the size, the instincts, the ability to get downhill. He's a good enough athlete. I just think he's a fantastic fit for what Philadelphia does. And to get this value at pick 31, this was somebody who, by most accounts, was a top 20 prospect in the draft. I had him, I think, within my top 10 when I did my final big board. So I was a huge fan of Jahad Campbell. Because of an injury, he falls to the back end of round 1, and you snag him despite the fact this team really didn't need a linebacker that much. But this is exactly what Philadelphia has been doing for years now, and it's managed to work out. When they took Jalen Carter, they didn't really desperately need a defensive tackle. Like, it was not the biggest of needs out there, but they took the best overall prospect, and now Jalen Carter is like one of the best defensive tackles in the NFL. When they took Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, they already had Darius Slay. Now, granted, they did need some help in that room, but you already had a Darius Slay there. But, they decided to double down and just take the best overall prospect, and it usually worked out. This is an Eagles team that I consistently think just does not overthink things. They just take the best available prospect, even if it's not necessarily the biggest positional need, and it usually manages to work out. Speaking of managing to work out, with their second overall pick and pick 64, they took one of my favorite prospects in safety Andrew Makuba from Texas. You guys see the flag right there. Andrew Makuba is just such a smart player that offers so much versatility for this defense. He is a little bit of an, I don't want to say undersized safety, but he's not the biggest safety in the world. So I do think in run support, he will struggle a little bit, but he's a fluid mover. His instincts are great. He just manages to always be near the football. And for Texas last year, again, my favorite team, you see the flag there, he felt like the finishing piece to what was a really good Texas secondary, but he just fit in so nicely. So now you add in an Andrew Makuba, who, by the way, I don't think he has to start necessarily this year, because there is some guys in that room that will play, but he might start at free safety with Reed Blankenship playing a bit more of a strong safety. Cooper DeJean also offers flexibility, but so does Andrew Makuba. Makuba for Clemson, before he transferred to Texas, he did play a little bit of nickel. So if they feel like Cooper DeJean might be a better fit at an outside corner position, maybe they move Makuba down to nickel. Or if they think Makuba's best set as a free safety, maybe they keep Cooper DeJean as that nickel corner. By adding an Andrew Makuba, there's so much more flexibility with this secondary that I think, honestly, he's like the perfect fit. He could play deep. He could play close to the line of scrimmage as like a nickel. I don't think he's good enough to play outside corner. I just don't think that's what his skill set is. But as just a guy who can rely on his instincts with Quinyon Mitchell, Reed Blankenship, and Cooper DeJean, I think he's just the perfect guy to add out there. A little bit later down the board with their 4th round pick, they took Ty Robinson, a big defensive tackle out of Nebraska, who has a little bit of twitch to him, has a little bit of burst. I think he can be a nice disruptor up there. Again, this is a Philly team that just find ways to add pieces that are talented as hell and they usually pan out for them. Smile Munden, Mac McWilliams, Drew Kendall, Kyle McCord, Miles Hinton. I want to talk about my next Texas Longhorn here. Cam Williams was basically a consensus late round 1, somewhere in round 2 draft pick. Like, there was a lot of mock drafts during the season where Cam Williams was like actually a first round pick. Because of an injury later in the season, his draft stock fell tremendously because he really struggled late after an injury, might I mention. And all of a sudden he goes from being this guy who could be a top 100 pick to following all the way down to number 207. And the Philadelphia Eagles are like, well, shoot, why not take a shot on this guy? Cam Williams is talented as hell. He was a starting offensive tackle for one of the best teams in the country last year in Texas, and he held his own for the most part. He's a big, strong individual that I think has the athleticism to get the task done. His issue is that he just needs to find ways to be a bit more nimble, a bit more athletic. He is such a big guy that you can kind of see a little bit of like a Mekhi Becton factor with him. But if there's a team that I could imagine could turn this big ball of clay into an actual starter at one point, it's freaking Philadelphia. Not saying Cam will ever be a starter for Philly, but if Cameron Williams pans out here, it could be one of the steals of the draft. All in all, like, they didn't really have a ton of draft capital, especially within the top 3 rounds, but afterwards they got a lot of value in round 5, round 6, and beyond. So I really like what they did here. They stocked up on some guys that they can develop. Not all of them will pan out. In fact, most of them will or won't. But if they can get like 2 guys from rounds 4 and beyond to end up being impactful guys for this team as either depth options or maybe starters, like, that's a successful draft, especially if Jahad Campbell and Andrew Makubo really work out. So for me, huge thumbs up for this draft. I thought they just, swing of a bat, home run hit for this team. So now we get to the depth chart of the Philadelphia Eagles. And look, there is an argument to be made that this is a worse roster from what it was last year. And that kind of is to be expected. A lot of times you'll see teams go out there, win a Super Bowl, and then the next thing you know, that next year they look like a shell of themselves. That's not going to be the case for Philadelphia. On the offensive end, they only lost 1 starter, and that was their right guard in Mekhi Becton. Outside of that, you bring back Jalen Hurts, who is, an awesome, potentially top 5 quarterback in the league. By the way, Tanner McKee, the backup, is an awesome backup too. He looks really good in preseason so far. Saquon Barkley at running back, maybe the best running back in football. A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, maybe the best duo in football. They're also back. Jahan Dotson's now here. You also made the trade for John Mechie. I actually think John Mechie could have a role with this team. He's a really solid slot receiver. Dallas Goedert's there at tight end. Your offensive line, Mailata is one of the best left tackles in the league. Lane Johnson, I think, is the best offensive lineman in the league. Landon Dickerson is just fully incredible at left guard. Cam Jurgens had a nice year last year. And then Tyler Steen at right guard is a bit of a question mark. But when you have 4 of the 5 guaranteed to be awesome players, then hopefully just that right guard can't be a weakness for you. So offensively, a new offensive coordinator, I think it's also fair to mention that as well. And we have seen coordinators kind of throw Philadelphia off. Obviously, 2023 is the big example. But I'm not overly concerned, at least not right now. We'll have to wait and see when the season starts. I think this offense has talent. I think they have depth. I think they have superstars. I think they have selfless players. And I just love this team, man. I love this offense. This offense is going to be really good. Now, defense has a couple of new faces. This is primarily where you're going to see a little bit of some regression. Last year, the Eagles defense was, by most accounts, either the best or one of the best defenses in the league. This year, I'm not quite expecting that same dominance, but I still expect this Philadelphia defense to probably end up around that top 5 mark. And with an offense that I think will easily be top 10 and a defense that I think can maintain that top 5 status, you're talking about a damn good team. So again, the losses here will stink. But, losing a Milton, losing a Josh, losing Darius, losing some guys here and there, it's all going to sting a little bit. But I think they have the guys to kind of make up for it. On the defensive line, we'll start off with more of the interior. Moro Ojomo is going to be asked to perform a little bit better than what he has been the past few years. He's going to be more of an impactful guy, likely a starter come week 1. So we'll see if he can fully develop to become some piece here that can be an impactful starter. Jordan Davis is a nice little run stuffer up the middle, big body guy who doesn't really give you much as a pass rusher, but he's a big, strong dude that can stuff the run. Jalen Carter is sort of that X factor up the middle, and as he continues to get better and better year in and year out, this year could be his best year of his career, which is scary to think about. Off the edge, you got some new faces showing up here. Nolan Smith is now your full-time starter. Last year, he got a lot of reps too, but this year he is going to be down probably almost every single down. You got Azeez Ojulari there there with them as well. Jalix Hunt, who you're fully developing, and Joshua Uche. We'll see how this group kind of pans out. I think right now your starters will probably be, my best guess would be Nolan Smith and Jalix Hunt, because they just have more familiarity with the team. But I wouldn't be surprised if Azeez Ojulari starts opposite of him. At your linebackers, you do have Zach Bond, Nakobe Dean returning, Jahad Campbell, and Jeremiah Trotter. I mean, those are incredible depth options. Those guys look poised to make some plays out there too. Again, keep an eye on Jahad Campbell and his overall alignment. I wouldn't be surprised if they have this guy kind of just out there to get after the quarterback. In your secondary, right now it's a bit up in the air as to who's going to be your starters, but Quinyon Mitchell, guaranteed to be one of your outside starters. Cooper DeJean, ESPN has listed as their starting nickel, but he can kind of be moved around to wherever you really want him to be at. Right now, they have the other opposite corner starter as Adoree Jackson, but they also did make a trade for Jacorian Bennett, and they have Kelly Ringo, who's been in the team for a few years. Not to mention, we talked a bit earlier about how Andrew Makuba can move around, and so can Cooper DeJean, so we'll keep an eye on that one. Right now, ESPN has Adoree Jackson as that opposite corner of Quinyon Mitchell. And then at safeties, you have Reed Blankenship, you have Sidney Brown, and you have Andrew Makuba. We'll see kind of how all of that pans out. All in all, this Eagles defense, there's some new faces here for sure, a lot of new faces, but I'm not overly concerned. I think they have the stars. I think they have the general talent. I think they have depth here too. And because Philadelphia has a great defensive coordinator and a team that has consistently been able to develop guys at a high level, I'm not worried about this Philadelphia defense. So all in all, when I look at the NFC, the favorites have to be Philadelphia. They returned their big three on offense of Saquon, Jalen Hurts, and A.J. Brown. The offensive line, for the most part, is the exact same, and I think they have two of the best tackles in the entire league. Dallas Goedert's an awesome tight end. Hopefully, he could just stay healthy. Defensively, I think they maintain their superstars, but they did lose a little bit of depth that will, end up affecting them in some ways. But they have their superstar on Jalen Carter. They have Nolan Smith developing as an awesome pass rusher. You got Nakobe Dean, Zach Bond, an awesome linebacker prospect in Trotter and Jahad Campbell. You have Quinyon Mitchell, who was in the conversation for Defensive Rookie of the Year. Cooper DeJean, awesome cornerback as well, who had the big pick six in the Super Bowl with some young talent around him there too. This is an incredible team, and when you look at the landscape of the NFC, I think there are some questions that Philly has to answer, but they're not necessarily make or break type question. When you look at the Detroit Lions, who by most accounts were the Eagles' #1 sort of competitor last year until sort of injuries kind of affected their season. But in Detroit, 2 new coordinators. You also lose your starting center. Their #1 pass rushers coming off a broken leg. A lot of questions there in Detroit. When you look at the Washington Commanders, they're a good team, but they're also not nearly as good as the Philadelphia Eagles. We all saw that in the playoffs last year, how Philly was just able to handle business there. The LA Rams are a really good team, but they have a quarterback that we're not sure if he can manage to stay healthy, and we saw this Philadelphia Eagles team have success running the football against that really good front seven of LA. And really, outside of that, like Green Bay, Minnesota, Arizona, Seattle, San Francisco, Dallas, I think those teams have talent. I think they could maybe give them a run for their money, but I would still favor Philadelphia by a fairly reasonable amount against every single one of those teams. So, is it possible Philly does just lose after maybe having a bad game in the playoffs? Yes, it could happen to anyone. We've seen that happen with Kansas City where, Kansas City has a bad day and they get blown out by Philly in the Super Bowl. They have a bad day versus Tampa Bay and they get blown out by Tampa Bay. Shit just kind of happens. For all we know, the losses of Philadelphia could be massive losses that end up affecting their season. It's totally possible. But as we sit here today, on paper, I look at this Philly team, I look at the continuity, I look at all the guys leaving and all the guys coming in, and I think for the most part, they did a really solid job of filling out their roster. I think this team has the depth, the starters, the superstars, everything. You've heard the video. I think this team's gonna be really good. So you let me know in the comment section below, will Philadelphia win the Super Bowl in 2025? And if they will, hit the like and subscribe button. Love you guys. Peace.